When I speak to you this evening, I do not speak to those who count themselves by numbers, nor to those who measure their worth by the density of their social circle. I speak to a quieter kind of soul, one who has learned often painfully that proximity does not guarantee intimacy, and that company does not always mean communion. There is a particular psychological maturity that arrives when an empath, once surrounded by many, now stands with only a few or sometimes none and does not collapse. Instead, something within them becomes strangely calm, contained, and inwardly guarded. This state is frequently misunderstood by the outer world, and even more tragically misunderstood by the empath themselves in earlier years, when solitude felt like exile rather than protection. You see, the psyche does not retreat without reason. When an empath withdraws from excess connection, it is not because the soul has failed at love, but because it has learned something essential about psychic economy, the unconscious, which is vastly more intelligent than our conscious ideals, begins to regulate exposure once it recognizes a recurring pattern of injury. What appears outwardly as social thinning is inwardly a boundary formation, an instinctual recalibration. The psyche says, quietly but firmly, enough. In my clinical work and in my own inner encounters, I have observed that empaths are not born with thin skin, rather, they are born with porous ones. Their psychological membrane is permeable. They feel before they think. They absorb atmospheres, moods, unspoken tensions, and unowned emotions from others as though these were their own. Early in life, this quality often brings praise. The empath is called understanding, kind, special, wise beyond their years. But the unconscious keeps score even when consciousness romanticizes suffering. And over time, the cost of unfiltered closeness accumulates. What eventually protects the empath is not advice, nor affirmation, nor even insight in the intellectual sense. It is experience. Experience carves grooves in the psyche that no doctrine can replace. Repeated emotional betrayal, subtle exploitation, chronic misattunement, and the quiet burden of being the one who listens but is never truly heard. These do not simply wound, they instruct. They teach the empath what kinds of closeness lead to depletion and which silences feel safer than company. At this point, something critical occurs in the unconscious. The archetype of the self begins to intervene. Until then, the empath often lives under the dominion of what I might call the sacrificial persona, the identity built around being useful, available, emotionally generous, and endlessly understanding. This persona is not false, but it is incomplete. It becomes pathological when it is the only allowed form of being. The self, however, seeks wholeness, not virtue, and wholeness sometimes requires withdrawal. Thus, the empath with few friends is not lonely in the ordinary sense. Loneliness implies a hunger for connection unmet. What I observe instead is a soul that has learned discernment. Discernment is not coldness. It is not bitterness. It is the capacity to feel clearly where one's energy belongs and where it leaks away. Many empaths reduce their social world not because they desire less love, but because they desire a form of love that does not require self-erasure. There is often a period of confusion here, even grief. The empath looks around and sees others immersed in constant social exchange, in shared rituals, gatherings, conversations that flow easily, and a question arises in the conscious mind: what is wrong with me that I no longer want this? But the unconscious answers differently. It says, you are no longer willing to betray yourself in order to belong. This shift is deeply connected to the shadow. For many years, the empath's shadow contains anger, refusal, withdrawal, and even a quiet contempt for those who take without awareness. These qualities are pushed down because they contradict the empath's conscious identity as good, kind, and accommodating. Yet the shadow does not disappear. It waits, and when the psyche becomes too imbalanced, it erupts not as cruelty, but as distance. Distance, in this sense, is not punishment of others. It is the restoration of inner order. The empath begins to experience that fewer relationships bring greater psychic stability. The nervous system settles, dreams change, symbols of enclosure, walls, caves, high places, or guarded sanctuaries often appear. These are not signs of regression. They are images of protection, of psychic boundaries forming where none existed before. One must understand that the empath's loneliness, when it existed, was rarely caused by being alone. It was caused by being unseen while surrounded. That is a far more corrosive condition. To sit among others and feel psychically unrecognized creates a split within the soul. The empath learns to perform connection while internally withdrawing. This is the most dangerous stage, because the outer life appears intact while the inner life erodes. When that erosion becomes intolerable, the psyche chooses a different path. Friends fall away not always through conflict, but through quiet disinterest, energetic mismatch, or the simple refusal to continue explaining oneself. The empath stops translating their depth into something more digestible. They stop shrinking their inner world to fit the emotional range of others. And because of this, many connections dissolve naturally. From the outside, this looks like loss. From the inside, it feels like relief. I want to be very clear here. This is not a stage of superiority. The empath with few friends is not more evolved in some moral sense. They are more experienced in the consequences of unprotected openness. They have learned, often the hard way, that intimacy without reciprocity is not intimacy at all. It is exposure. In dreams, such individuals may encounter figures who stand at gates, guardians, silent watchers, or old wise men and women who speak little but see much. These are archetypal images of inner authority beginning to take form. The psyche is no longer outsourcing safety to others. It is developing it internally, and this internalization of safety changes everything. Once the empath no longer depends on external validation for emotional grounding, the urgency to maintain many relationships disappears. What remains is a preference for resonance over frequency. One genuine connection outweighs 10 draining ones. Silence becomes restorative rather than threatening. Solitude turns from punishment into medicine. This is why the empath with few friends often appears calm in ways that unsettle others. There is less reactivity, less need to explain, less urgency to be understood by everyone. Understanding is now selective. It is offered where it is likely to be met. Not everywhere it is demanded. Yet this stage is not without its dangers. The psyche can overcorrect, protection can harden into isolation, discernment can slip into avoidance. This is why the empath must remain in dialogue with the unconscious. Through dreams, reflection, and honest confrontation with their own fears, the goal is not to disappear from relationship, but to enter it consciously. Still, what must be honored is that the reduction of friendships is often a necessary phase of individuation. Individuation does not mean becoming alone, it means becoming oneself. And for the empath, becoming oneself requires a radical re-education of boundaries. The world often teaches empaths that their sensitivity is a resource for others. Rarely does it teach them that it is also a responsibility to themselves. Experience is the teacher that corrects this imbalance. Experience says, you do not owe access to your inner world simply because you are capable of understanding others. And so, when you encounter an empath with few friends, do not assume absence of love. Often you are witnessing the aftermath of too much love given too freely, for too long, without protection. What you see is not emptiness, it is containment. In the next movement of this lecture, I will speak more deeply about how this containment reshapes identity itself, how the persona dissolves, how old relational archetypes lose their grip, and how the empath's solitude becomes the ground from which a more authentic form of connection may eventually emerge, one that does not cost the soul its center. When this containment first takes shape, it often feels unfamiliar, even uncanny, to the empath. There is a strange quiet that descends, not the quiet of abandonment, but the quiet that follows a long internal war finally coming to rest. Many describe it as emptiness at first, but this is a misinterpretation born of habit. The psyche has grown accustomed to constant emotional traffic, to being occupied by the needs, moods, and expectations of others. When that traffic stops, the nervous system does not immediately recognize peace. It registers absence. And absence, to a psyche trained in vigilance, can feel dangerous. Yet, if one stays with this quiet rather than fleeing it, something remarkable begins to happen. The empath starts to encounter themselves not as a function, not as a responder, not as a mirror for others, but as a presence. This is profoundly unsettling at first. Without the familiar role of emotional caretaker, the question arises, who am I when no one is leaning on me? This question does not come from curiosity alone. It comes from the collapse of an old identity. Here we must speak of the persona more precisely. The empath's persona is often built early as an adaptation to unstable or emotionally demanding environments. Sensitivity becomes a survival tool. Reading others accurately reduces danger. Anticipating emotional shifts maintains attachment. Over time, this adaptive structure solidifies into a character, the one who understands, who soothes, who bridges, who absorbs. Society rewards this persona, but the unconscious exacts a price. The price is a gradual estrangement from one's own instinctual limits. When friendships thin out, this persona loses its stage. There are fewer interactions in which it is required, fewer moments to perform emotional labor. The persona, deprived of reinforcement, begins to weaken, and when a persona weakens, anxiety often increases not because something is wrong, but because something false is dissolving. The psyche is shedding a skin that once protected it but now constricts it. This is why many empaths in this phase feel both relieved and vaguely unmoored. The old reflex to reach outward is still there, but it is no longer obeyed automatically. Instead, there is a pause, and in that pause, the unconscious speaks more clearly. Dreams during this period frequently involve themes of thresholds, abandoned houses, locked rooms, or solitary journeys. These are not symbols of deprivation, they are images of individuation underway. The psyche is withdrawing energy from collective patterns and redirecting it inward, toward integration. What was once distributed across many relationships is now being reclaimed. This reclamation often brings the shadow closer to consciousness. Anger, resentment, grief, and fatigue, long buried beneath understanding, begin to surface. The empath may suddenly realize how much was tolerated that should never have been normalized. There can be moments of sharp clarity, even bitterness, as the psyche reviews old bonds from a new vantage point. This is not regression, it is moral differentiation finally occurring. It is important to say this plainly. Many of the empath's former friendships were sustained not by mutuality, but by endurance. They lasted because the empath could tolerate more discomfort, more ambiguity, more emotional imbalance than the other person. When tolerance ends, so does the relationship, not because love has died, but because the unconscious refuses to continue a contract that was never equitable. At this stage, the empath may worry that they have become cold, detached, or inaccessible. But coldness is an absence of feeling. What is happening here is something else entirely. Feeling is still present, often more vivid than before, but it is no longer automatically offered. It is held, assessed, and shared selectively. This is not withdrawal from life, it is a reorientation toward it. There is a myth deeply ingrained in collective consciousness that abundance of connection equals psychological health, but the psyche does not measure richness by quantity, it measures it by coherence. Too many relationships that pull the soul in contradictory directions fragment the inner life. The empath learns, through lived consequence, that coherence requires limits. This is why the empath with few friends often develops a stronger inner dialogue. Without constant external input, the voice of the unconscious becomes louder, intuition sharpens, symbolic thinking deepens. The empath may find themselves drawn to solitary practices, long walks, creative work, or contemplative study, not as escape, but as nourishment. The psyche is reorganizing itself around a deeper center. Here, the archetype of the hermit often appears not as a literal withdrawal from society, but as an inner stance. The hermit archetype represents wisdom gained through separation, insight born of silence. It is not antisocial, It is trans-social. It exists beyond the compulsion to belong. When this archetype constellates, the empath begins to value inner alignment over external affirmation. Yet, there is often a subtle grief woven into this stage. The empath mourns not only lost friendships, but lost illusions, the belief that enough patience could fix imbalance, that love alone could educate others into reciprocity, that being understood was only a matter of trying harder. Letting go of these beliefs is painful because they were tied to hope. But hope, when it ignores reality, becomes self-betrayal. As these illusions fall away, something sturdier takes their place: inner authority. Inner authority does not announce itself loudly. It does not seek agreement. It manifests as a quiet certainty about what one will and will not participate in. The empath no longer negotiates their boundaries internally. Decisions become simpler, even if they are not always comfortable. This simplicity often confuses others. Former friends may accuse the empath of changing, becoming distant, or no longer caring. In one sense, they are correct. The empath no longer cares in the old way, the way that required self-neglect. But what has emerged is not indifference, it is discrimination. Care has been brought back under conscious stewardship. One must understand that this shift is not reversible by guilt. In earlier stages of life, guilt was a powerful lever. The empath could be pulled back into draining dynamics by appeals to loyalty, history, or emotional need. But once experience has taught the psyche that guilt equals depletion, that lever loses its power. The body itself resists. Fatigue appears instantly when old patterns are approached. The nervous system has learned. This learning is somatic as much as psychological. The empath's body often becomes the final arbiter of truth, where once they overrode exhaustion to maintain connection, they now listen. Where once anxiety was ignored in the name of harmony, it is now taken as information. The body becomes an ally rather than an obstacle. It is in this embodied wisdom that the myth of loneliness finally dissolves. Loneliness is not cured by proximity, it is cured by authenticity. The empath with few friends experiences less loneliness precisely because they are no longer divided against themselves, even alone. They are accompanied by an inner coherence that was impossible when surrounded by incompatible bonds. And yet, this is not the end of the story. This stage is a crossing, not a destination. The reduction of friendships clears the ground, but it also prepares the psyche for a different quality of connection. Once the empath no longer seeks others to regulate their inner state, they become capable of meeting others without losing themselves. In the next movement, I will speak of this emergence, how, after a period of necessary solitude, new forms of relationship may appear, not many, not loud, but deeply resonant. How the empath's sensitivity, once a liability, becomes a refined instrument, and how protection born of experience does not close the heart, but finally allows it to open without fear. When the psyche has passed through this long corridor of withdrawal and clarification, something subtle but decisive shifts in the inner landscape. The empath no longer experiences themselves as standing on the edge of relationship, waiting to be invited in, nor do they feel compelled to retreat behind walls. Instead, There is a sense of standing at the center of one's own psychic territory. From this center, connection becomes a choice rather than a reflex. This distinction is everything. You must understand how radical this is for an empath. For much of their life, connection was not chosen, it happened to them. Emotions arrived unannounced. Needs were perceived before they were spoken. Responsibility was assumed without consent. In such a condition, friendship was rarely evaluated. It was endured, managed, carried. The empath's inner life became a crossroads where many psychic currents passed through, few of them staying, most of them draining. Now, with experience as their quiet teacher, the empath center holds. This holding does not come from effort, it comes from a reorganized psyche. The unconscious has learned that survival does not require constant availability. Safety no longer depends on being indispensable. And so the empath sensitivity, once a wide open gate, becomes a finely tuned instrument. This is where a misunderstanding often arises. Others may look at the empath's small circle or their temporary lack of one and conclude that they have become closed, guarded, unreachable, but what has actually occurred is a refinement of contact. The empath no longer meets the world with their whole soul exposed. They meet it with presence, discernment, and proportion. Proportion is a word we do not use often enough in psychology, yet the psyche suffers immensely when proportion is absent. To give more than one can replenish, to listen longer than one can remain intact, to understand beyond what is reciprocated, these are imbalances that the unconscious cannot tolerate indefinitely. Experience teaches the empath the right measure, and with measure comes stability. It is at this point that new forms of relationship may begin to appear, though they often arrive quietly and without announcement. There is no rush toward them. The empath is no longer searching to be known. Instead, they are rooted in knowing themselves. From this rootedness, recognition happens naturally. One senses resonance rather than potential. The nervous system responds with ease rather than anticipation. These relationships are different in quality. They do not demand constant explanation. Silence within them does not feel threatening. There is room for difference without rupture. The empath does not feel required to translate their inner world into simpler terms to be accepted, nor do they feel compelled to carry the emotional weight of the other. Mutuality, though rare, becomes the standard rather than the exception, but even here, the psyche remains cautious. Experience does not disappear simply because conditions improve. It stands as a quiet guardian. If a new relationship begins to echo old patterns, subtle guilt, asymmetrical care, emotional dependency, the empath senses it quickly. The body tightens, dreams shift, fatigue appears. These are not neuroses, they are signals. The psyche has learned its own language and now trusts it. This trust in one's inner signals is perhaps the greatest gift of this entire process. Without it, even wisdom becomes theoretical. With it, life simplifies. Decisions that once required agonizing reflection now present themselves clearly. The empath no longer asks, "Am I being kind enough?" but rather, "Am I being true?" This is not a moral regression. It is a psychological maturation. We must speak here of love because many empaths fear that this process will cost them their capacity to love deeply. They worry that protection will dull their tenderness, that discernment will harden their hearts, but the opposite is often true. Love that no longer leaks into self-sacrifice becomes more potent, not less. When love is no longer mixed with fear of abandonment or hunger for validation, it becomes clearer, steadier, and far less exhausting.